Hey folks, I'm Dennis Rebelo. I'm the Chief Education Consultant for a company called Alex and Ani. My responsibility is the Corporate Institute, the learning arm. And my academic work is all around what it means to be human in the 21st century. The way I get there is through narrative or story. And whenever you can take your life and your work and you can integrate it into a narrative, well, that's an act of love. And if you can actually perform the narrative, people know and feel your positive energy. So my hope is that you check out the peak story model, which is right here, which I explain in my TED Talk that follows, and that you can stitch together a work-life narrative that makes you happier and acknowledge the beautiful life that you have. So today I'm going to speak to you about leadership in the 21st century. And I'm going to invite you to consider rethinking the intention of leaders, organizational members, and followers in organizations today, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, whether they're associations for recreational support or just a vision of a founder. All storytelling organizations have one thing in common. They encourage other folks that aren't the founders, to tell their stories. And this is a very complicated thing. It's a phenomenon, and I'm a phenomenologist. I actually went to school for it, believe it or not. Think of a visual of someone, a young boy or girl, 3 or 4 years old at the end of their driveway watching a parade. And imagine this child has not been informed on how to successfully story. The fire truck goes by, the sirens go off, the lollipops land at his or her feet. And dad comes to the driveway, the end, and says, "Hey, what did you see?" Or a grandfather or an uncle or a neighbor. And I'm telling you, the child will story. But then the child goes to school. And what happens there? Only speak when spoken. 2, raise your hand when you want to say something. And for years, how many years are we in school? 2, 3, 17. And then we eventually go to work, where you sit in a cube and you communicate electronically. And I think we've really forgotten how to story. Take a mental flight with me to when I was a kid. No, that wasn't me. This is Tupac Shakur and my boy Snoop Dogg on the left. And this is not a hologram. This is actually an image it's theatrical, and it's called ghosting. And everyone thought it was a hologram. This is a hologram. And you're probably wondering, why are you speaking about holograms? And it's because my story goes back to St. Rayfield Academy, where I went to high school. And at St. Rayfield Academy, with a little encouragement from my mother, I realized I needed to get recommitted to studies. I was a naturally pretty bright kid, and I loved studying, but I also liked sports. And my mother, my Irish Catholic mother, and if you have one of those or saw one in the movies, reminded me that she was paying for my tuition. Evidently had nothing to do with my father. And so I got recommitted to studies, gave up sports, and focused on school. And it was through the lens of literature that I stumbled across a book written by Itzhak Bentov. No, it's not on the New York Times bestseller now, nor was it then. And it was called, Itzhak Bentov wrote this book called Stalking the Wild Pendulum. And inside the book was a word that I'd never seen before, and it was hologram. You've seen them, right? On the back of your credit cards. And I'm not talking about this type of hologram. I'm talking about a 3-dimensional image like this, floating in space. I pedaled off to my Portuguese grandmother's home on my BMX bike, my Diamondback, very popular bike in the 80s when you're 15. Not as popular as a car, but it was close. And I actually found something, because my Portuguese grandmother kept every magazine in her library. She had every Time magazine, she had every National Geographic, and I found just a little visual of what we saw in my pocket, but bigger, of a hologram. But she only had one sighting of hologram in all of her literature, so I went to the Cumberland Public Library, and they had 3 sightings. So then I went and I sprung off to New York City to the Museum of Holography on Mercer Street. So in this path of life of mine, I stumbled across something called a hologram. So what does that really mean? I'm going to take you to my whiteboard. And I am not going to challenge Jeff in drawing. And what I realized is that if I wanted to recreate this hologram, I said, if something beautiful, a three-dimensional image can appear and somebody can do it, well then so can I, because if something is worth doing beautifully, I bet there's a system that can support it. So I realized that if you took a laser and you split it, and you expanded the beam and put it on a holographic plate, of course I had to buy a laser at $900. That meant that somebody had to sponsor me. And then I took, of all things, an angel, again, no influence from my Catholic mother, figurine, and I reflected it back on the plate. This is called a reference beam. This is called an object beam because it goes off the object. And I did this all on a very small table, a 2,000-pound sand table sitting on inner tubes in my basement that I was helped by my father to build. Enter my dad in my story. And what I realized after winning the science fair at 16 is that this was a really great way to get scholarships, but it was a better way to fuel my interest and my passions, to understand things that seemed so beautiful yet were so difficult to create. But what I realized when I was at the University of Rochester, that there was something, which, by the way, is a leading school for optics and laser energetics and physics. I realized there was something far more complicated than lasers and holography. Human beings at work. This is me as a kid. Don't you love that flock of seagulls hairdo right there? And those were my hero days. I worked alone, and I did things alone. But it got me attention in areas that sort of honored who I was. And then I made the big jump from the left brain logic to the right brain emotion. And emotions are so hard to understand. So there enters complexity again, another challenge. And at this point, I decided to petition the school to get a degree with the Simon School, the graduate school, and 2 undergraduate departments in studying human behavior at work, organizational behavior. And I kept going back to graduate school because of the complexity of being human at work. This is Berta Mook on the left and Bernd Jaeger on the right. This is 2 summers ago at Oxford, where I presented my storytelling research. You see, it's amazing that people actually go onto Facebook. 1/7 of the world has a Facebook account. And we share, yes, this is true. And you have one, don't you? Okay. And then what we do is we post what we like to eat and who we're with, correct? And what we're celebrating and all kinds of other things. But when we're faced with another human being and we try to tell our story, we stumble. And it got me to thinking, holy mackerel, we are onto something. So this is what happens, by the way. And you'll experience this. Andre O'Brien, my friend, the Irish guy who spoke before me, you know he's Irish, right? He told you that? When you're networking with O'Brien, you'll realize that you'll have a need to story. Who are you and what are you all about? And then you're going to roll into unclear direction. You're going to stutter or stammer a little bit, even though you might not naturally be a stammerer or stutterer. And that's because you're going through all of these Facebook moments that you can't find words for. Story vault. And you're trying to figure out who is it that I'm speaking to, and what's their identity, and what identity do I want, and what is the culture of the telling. And then you're going to go in and you're going to start a sentence and they're going to give you feedback and you're going to go blah, blah this way, blah, blah, blah that way. We call that a rough unfolding. And eventually the moment will be over and then you'll realize what worked, what didn't. You'll keep what worked, you'll edit and flatten some of your story, and you'll create an episodic variation over time. And with proper grooming and attention, it'll be effective. Boy, that's a lot of work. But you can't go up to people in an first interview and say, I'm practicing my story, so bear with me. I'd love to do work with your department from my department's perspective, but I'm going to pretty much fail here at expressing it because it impacts how you're regarded or validated. So then I started thinking about Maslow as I was writing this essay. Now, as president of Alex and Ani's corporate university, I'm particularly interested in the path of life that we follow, both for people outside of the company and inside. And what I thought was so amazing is that time and time again, one of the most requested charms on our bangles is, so we're meaning making by design. We want to have an impact, and we want our narratives or our stories to be larger than ourselves. I realized that over my time in listening to stories, dissecting them and co-crafting them with executives and organizational members from all types of companies and associations, that the leadership story that we hear more often is self-serving. We go into past moments of our life, we relate them to our current life, and then we move to the future. And we have lots of past experiences, and they meet right now needs. So if you wanted to be credentialized in your area as a journalist, you might say, great, I went to school, I studied writing. I went to this particular school, I went to Emerson, and then from there I did an MFA. Or whatever it might be. Or I worked in this particular domain, and people will then say, oh, he's a hero or a ruler, or she's a hero or a ruler. So I started thinking, does the self-serve nature of the intention match the possibility of the image of what the audience wants to see in a person, a leader, or a follower, or a fellow organizational member? And then I realized there's probably another story, and this is like belonging. Everybody needs to tell a self-serving story, right? Because that's like eating, I thought. And then you could tell a collaborative story, because after all, you can't do life alone. So to the extent that you can find past lived experiences, connect them to the current role that you're in. So in other words, if the CEO of Alex and Ani, Giovanni Ferrosi, tells a very focused story about that intends to show his credentials in understanding intelligence and interdepartmental meetings and communications flow, if I grant him that hero right, it'll allow him to then collaborate with me. But if I don't think he's good at understanding that, he'll never get to collaboration. And so I get to see this lived out in both Alex and Ani and Alex and Ani's corporate university all the time. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool, but who sits here and why? Who stands for the greater good, and how do we get there? And I realized that this is more about calling, that internal, deeply internal pull or tug that you have within you. And that's standing for the greater good. And I call this a virtuous story. If you intend to be virtuous with your story, and you can get that granted, then the lover within you, and those who wish to see lovers out there, people who care for other human beings, well, that'll happen. Here's a top view, much more simplistic. This is coming home to who you're meant to be. In an organizational life, we just don't do that. We get folks into the companies in which we work. We onboard them and we say, here's your job description. Like they're static. I look at peak stories as having evidence. My story is that with the help of Giovanni Ferrosi and Carolyn Rafalian, I've been able to give birth to Alex and Ani University. So now I have evidence of what I love to do in my calling. And you see, a calling is antecedent to meaningful work. And if I wasn't able to work with them collaboratively and with their executive team and vice presidents to form the courses that are housed within the corporate university, I couldn't possibly teach our folks within retail stores how to have deeper engagement with other human beings around meaning making. And I certainly couldn't teach executives how to tell their own story of the big why they're at Alex and Ani in a dialogical way that created warmth and acceptance and assimilation. And they couldn't tell it to the outside world in a way, or even create divisions of the company like Charity by Design, fueling nonprofit success through interorganizational relationships. We teach this because story matters to us at Alex and Ani. We teach this because we know that if we can create dwelling places for you where you feel alive and like yourself, you'll better serve the organization and yourself, and it's just the right thing to do. And either you have evidence of that or you don't. And I'm here to also remind you that I think we all have a duty. We need to really rethink the way we handle ourselves in these organizations in which we sit today. I think, in fact, I'm convinced that we need to transform them. I think last count with some folks in an audience, I had some hands raised, and most people actually were awake at home for 3 hours at night after work on average. So I'm thinking we're probably at work more than we're at home. So why don't we make those positive places and positive stories that pour into our personal lives as opposed to create compartments? A few weeks ago, I realized the impact of our stories as they pour in by email. It was before lunch, and this just came to me as something that needed to be out there. And this is our storytelling manifesto, and it's more evidence that we are focused on disciplined story as a way of being conscious with respect to who we are and who we're meant to be as people. This is your story. This is yours, it's no one else's. Story like you mean it. Have some intentionality, mean it. If you aren't in character, jump in. Be in the role in which you're supposed to be in. If you're not, change it. You've been divinely placed here for a reason. What's meant for you shall not pass you. Honor your calling and act upon it with purpose. Love is within all of us. Show us yours, that center part of the triangle. Your work is your plus story. Give back as a practice. Interconnect. To story is uniquely human. Think of the little boy or girl in your mind, the person who you wondered about when I asked you to think of someone at the end of the driveway, walking to the dad or mom or uncle, explaining by story what she or he experienced in the parade moment. Consciously create a collaborative one. You're not alone. Judge less, invite more, and be at peace. You're blessed. Retell the power of story with love. Story your dream. Yes, as a verb, story it. And I believe that it'll settle your soul. Inspired by doing. This is our manifesto. It can be yours. And we find these artifacts critical in ensuring that we're right tracking. When I wrote Inspired by Doing, this is what I meant. It's in the doing that we confirm belief. Practices support what you believe in, the things that you do. Words alone only show intention. If they don't match up with practices, it's a puff of air. So let your breadcrumb trail be one of purpose. And rethink your work as storytelling work. And take control over your lives, inside and outside every organization, whether it's a family, a business, a nonprofit. And I believe that you'll probably have some company along the way. Because by design, we're meant to be together. Thanks for letting me share my story with you today and the work that's been central to my life. Messy diagram, let me break it down. You start off as a hero, you move to giving care and having experience showing and supporting that. And over time, you'll connect your calling with meaningful work. When you do that, that's the act of love we're talking about within our storytelling lives. My invitation is that you re-examine the talk and take notes and apply to your own life. The philosophy of peak storytelling. Thanks, and here's to your beautiful life.